Welcome everybody to this next edition of the KDVI Learning Lab. We're delighted to have you along for this session, which is around genies that have come out of the bottle. And thank you to KDVI for creating this space. This is going to be co-hosted by Claire Pointing and myself. I'm sure most of you will know who we are, but you can easily find us on the KDVI website if not. We're going to run a very different kind of session today, different from if you've been participating in the previous ones. It'll have a little difference in the format, and the format's going to be as follows. We're going to invite you for the first 10 minutes or so to be what we might call fly on the wall, or we're going to be in a goldfish bowl if you want to use another animal, and you're going to observe a conversation that we're going to just sort of auto-generate between the two of us. It's going to be sort of just a la mode, in the moment, not manufactured. We have not rehearsed this, but we think there's some interesting stuff that we want to bring up, and the idea will be that we provoke you into thinking about some of these things yourself. And we're going to give you a really nice chunk of time in groups to go away and discuss some of the things that hopefully we've provoked you to think about, but not necessarily riff on the same themes that we've talked about. Before we actually break you into these rooms, we're going to give you an opportunity to journal some ideas. And I'll explain why at that time, why we're going to do that. So that's why it was important that you have a piece of paper and a pen, something that you can really write a few things down before we put you into the breakout rooms. When we come out of the breakout rooms, we're going to ask you to report in via the chat function on the right-hand side of your screens, and then we will sort of go around the room and talk with you a little bit about that and socialize some ideas. As usual, it would be helpful if you would be mute during the course of the first part of this presentation, if you like, so that we don't hear background noises. And of course, when you come out of the breakout rooms, we would like any comments to be unattributed, just in the interest of the privacy of the clients that are on the call with us and the rest of you associates and other people that have been welcomed along. So with all of that said, and if I haven't missed anything, Claire and I would just like to talk about a few things, and we've been talking sort of on and off for the last couple of months actually about what's happening, and we've been talking to our clients and talking to our colleagues, and a couple of key things, a couple of key areas for concentration have come up. And the first of which is, you know, how is this changing business? How is this crisis affecting and changing business? And to be really topical with this, Claire, we were talking about this Edelman report that came out yesterday, and what we noticed was that trust in government during this crisis has gone up across the world. Trust in NGOs has gone up across the world, and yet trust in business has dropped dramatically, and in all the major markets. And we felt this was significant. It's significant for individuals, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, but it's significant because it means the business that people will return to may look and feel very different to the way it was when people left. And I think you had some kind of interesting thoughts about that, and I was going to invite you just to sort of share those back with me for a few moments, and then we'll just kind of get going.
In the spirit of full disclosure, Graham and I had a conversation yesterday, which, if we manage to recreate it today, will leave me looking mad and Graham looking like a sage. So, I mean, one of the things we started talking about was really following on from Manfred's conversation a month ago or so, which was using a psychodynamic lens to look at what's happening in the crisis, and then building on Roger Lehman's discussion on fault lines, and also Thomas's discussion on sort of the emotional impact of the crisis. And we thought this was a really good point, and actually the report that Graham's referring to is a nice hook for this as well, to think about, well, what's moving in the system, what's changing in the system, which is being triggered by the lack of choice and the lack of options that COVID has presented businesses with, on the one hand, but on the other hand, seem to be changes which have been either desired or called for over time, and yet have been impossible to implement because there's been resistance in culture, or the decisions have been too difficult. And that, coupled with the way that business has been held up as a great beacon of success, a measure of success within society, has sort of led there to be almost a sort of a good way to do business, which the coronavirus seems to have thrown on its head. And so a lot of the things that we've thought about and believed around, you know, what is good leadership, what constitutes responsible behaviour within systems, whether it's individually, organisationally, or societally, who do we respect, has actually been thrown into question. And one of the things that I'm very interested in, anyone who knows me knows that I talk about this quite a lot, is what are we going to see shift, that even if leaders from the pre-COVID world wanted to return to, even if individuals and businesses want to go back, what has shifted that actually means that we're going to see a significant transition to a new way of working? And if Alicia could put up the Bridges model that we've got on the slide, I think before Graham comes in, it's just worth sort of thinking about where we are from a sort of a transition point of view at the moment. Because one of the things that I find very interesting, and I think Graham's going to touch on as well, is we see a lot of conversation in the press about the new normal, and that we are in a new normal. And actually, this is based on the structure you can see is based on the Bridges model. And actually, where we are is not in a new normal, but we're somewhere between ending, losing, and letting go, and a neutral zone. And when you look at what's being reported, whether it's in terms of trust being lost or whether it's in terms of how businesses operate, we aren't actually in a position to say what's going to happen, because there are going to be multiple different ways of approaching this to accommodate the shifts that we're seeing in the system. Is that what you wanted me to say, Graham?
Yeah, I mean, this is beautiful, and you gave me loads of kind of cues, and you made me think about some things. I mean, you know, what if we focused on, for example, a sector, you know, the airline sector is very clearly affected by this. And, you know, we were looking at the FT together, and you know, you pointed out that BA over the last 10 years had returned something like $4.6 billion to shareholders, and yet now it's scrambling for cash. So as you said a few moments ago, you know, the way that businesses are conducted is thrown into question. Also, you know, looking at another airline, and you just triggered another thought, was, you know, sort of certain people who previously may have been the darlings of the business world. And I was thinking of Richard Branson. You know, if anyone's gone on Twitter in the last couple of months and read what people are saying about Richard Branson, I mean, you would think he'd become something closer to the devil, because of course, you know, he's been tax haven for 15 years and has paid no tax, and yet now would like the British government to, you know, to bail out or to put a slug of cash into his airline. And, you know, this raises all sorts of existential questions, which is, you know, do we have a right to a certain amount of airlines and cheap travel? So the sort of the moral and value systems of people come into this whole conversation too. I guess the other ways that it's going to affect people and businesses and the way that businesses are run, though, is in the sense that we're going to be working remotely, and we were thinking a little bit about the sort of, it affects not only business, what business stands for, but also the way people work within those businesses. And I suppose the bridge to that would be something along the lines of, why do people come to work? And what are they coming to work for? What is the true purpose of what we do? And of course, literally, if you pick apart the sentence I just chose, which is, why do people come to work? Well, they're not going to be coming to work, and they're certainly not going to be coming to work as much. And so if you're just sitting alone in your home office, your job becomes your identity. And there's this great quote from Marcus Aurelius, who said, you know, we are what we repeatedly do. And he was talking about identity, but also about our sort of, you know, the way that we comport ourselves to the world. And if we are what we repeatedly do, and we're sitting just at home, and we're contributing to a business that we don't at large really subscribe to from a values perspective, then we might want to change that. We might see a lot of younger people, younger generation particularly, saying, why am I in fact doing this? So as my final thought, which links to that thought, was, when you look into that report, why people in general have lost a lot of trust in business, it came down to 2 or 3 things. One of them was, we don't know what the future of work looks like, and we don't trust our leadership to deliver it to us. And we don't trust that technology won't automate our jobs. Now, this survey was done before the crisis. I mean, it's just literally been released. But now I suspect those 2 things will have been exacerbated in people's mind, and their emotions will be even more, sort of amplified by the fact that no one knows what we're going back to.
So I think that's really, and I'd actually challenge you on something, which is this idea that, how do we come to work isn't necessarily exclusively a physical thing. And so I think there's something kind of interesting about what work means, but also how we engage with work. And I'm going to shamelessly steal something that Lorenz Freudenberg has said a couple of times over the conversations we've had, which is, how we come back to work, how we are invited back to work, is also going to be an important part of the shifts that we see. And I won't say it anywhere near as eloquently as Lorenz has said, but actually one of the key issues that leadership in this new sort of fragility of trust is going to have to deal with, whether they like it or not, is when I ask people to re-engage both physically but also economically with business, how I invite them back into the workplace will in some ways define the identity they have themselves, but also how they view their value or their reward or their engagement or their status with the organization. And so are we going to see this kind of emergence of, if I'm invited physically back to the office, does that make me more important? Does that change my status, my role? And hopefully Lorenz will be able to come and share a sort of a slightly more elegant description of that. But that's interesting because, this idea of the nature of work, the identity of work, also plays into how you are viewed in terms of where you're located or how you're connected to the workplace as well. And I think one final thing I think is quite interesting is a lot of the things I'm hearing about are organisations, certainly in the City of London, seeing this as an opportunity to cut down at some point in the near future on the cost of prime office space, because people manifestly don't need to come to work all the time. And that raises an interesting question, because on the one hand, that sounds great, flexible working from home, but actually they're placing the cost of the working environment back on the individual, which is interesting.
So to counter that, what I've heard is that people may well have satellite offices that run around, if you want to use London as an example, but I suppose that would be a proxy for many cities in the world, that they would have a central meeting point and a hub, but also then there might be satellite offices where small groups of people could come and meet. But it raises a bigger question, which is whether or not people actually want to be invited back to the office. And, I've been in touch with some younger executives who are, of course, quite comfortable with this new way of working, and the fact that, and it's been very surprising to them, that their employers have decided that even though they were against any kind of remote working previously, there is now a high degree of trust in them being able to do that and to execute. I suspect, though, that there are 2 things that will, be variables in all of that. One of them will be, can we live with imperfection? Are we going to be able to get done what we previously got done highly efficiently in the same way? And I suspect the other thing that people will look at even more closely is whether or not we can truly innovate in this kind of environment, because innovation leads to sustainable productivity. And it remains to be seen, especially if you looked at somewhere like Silicon Valley, where you have a lot of engineers sitting together and riffing off each other's ideas, whether they can truly do that remotely. Now, Claire, it occurs to me that we have 30 people or so listening into this conversation. And, you know, I've suddenly realized they probably get very bored with listening to us and maybe would want to go and kind of generate some of these ideas and thoughts and discuss some of this stuff amongst themselves. So if I can just stop us here, because we're going to come back and talk a little bit later, but if I can turn to you, the audience, who, you know, you've listened in on this a little bit and some of the things that Claire and I have been talking about, not only this morning, but over the last month or so, and say, so you probably have some ideas of your own, and you probably have some thoughts around this sort of this shift in the system, because this is a systemic shift. And as Claire says and continues to point out to me, because I tend to be rather unsophisticated, I'm a bit binary, and she says it's not, you know, it's yes and, it's both and, it's, you know, there are grey zones in all of this, it's not sort of one thing or another thing, is to really discuss with each other what's happening from your perspective. So if we can put up the question that we would like to pose you, first of all, so Alicia, if you can help us with that. There are two questions that we would like you to go off and discuss for a little while. But before doing so, we're going to give you 3 minutes to sit with your piece of paper and your pen and journal something. And this act of journaling is a way of taking your reflections and essentially processing them, putting them from your mind onto a piece of paper. And this is a way of kind of constructing and reconstructing your thoughts in a way that sort of creates a formula for you with which you can kind of present them. So we're going to give you actually just 3 minutes of silence. Starts now. You can see the questions, and we'd just like you to write down whatever comes to mind. Okay, so if you just finish off what you're writing, those final thoughts, and I guess if we gave you nothing else in this session, we gave you 3 minutes of silence, which I tend to feel in and of itself is a gift. Certainly feels like that for me, and I hope for you too. But an opportunity to really kind of think about a few things. So what we'll now do is we're going to break you into some groups and have you sit and discuss this for a little while. We're going to give you 30 minutes. We're going to give you a really nice chunk of time to really talk some stuff through together. were thinking about the role of leadership as it going forward in society. And what does it mean and what will it mean to be a leader in society? And has that shifted, in fact? Are the traditional archetypes of leadership currently being torn down? And actually something new will be reinstated? What do we value in our previous leaders, and will we still value that going forward? And I think maybe you could say a little bit about, I thought you made a fascinating remark when you were talking with me about Brexit, which is a controversial subject, but it's not a politically charged one in this context. One, because it's happened, and two, because we don't have a point of view on it. It was just an interesting remark that you made.
Can you remind me what it was?
I can. So you said that the way that leaders are responding, if we think about just the UK for a moment, and I guess everyone has sight of what's happening here as we do all around the world, that the way that the UK government leadership, if you like, has responded to the COVID crisis was founded on the way that they responded to Brexit. Namely, if we give some very coherent messaging, people will fall into line and do what we want them to do. And I think where I kind of said, maybe there's something else to consider here, was the role of science. And of course, science in this particular crisis has become more influential and more important because the feedback loop of what we're seeing has become that much quicker. There's proof of what's happening.
I think the other element was that unlike the Brexit debate, which was essentially an abstract economic debate with a degree of national emotion, here the COVID crisis is a lived experience for every single person in the country, and there is a tangible, real impact, and there's an interesting relationship between political messaging and lived experience, which is in some ways challenging trust in how we view the information we get, and in some ways consolidating trust as well, depending on what's happening in different countries. And I think that's a fascinating area to think about, what we expect and what we hope for from leaders in different parts of the world that we live in, whether it's organizational, societal, or even in our communities.
And I think, just to build on that and to come back to something that Floris said with his first and initial comment when people were reporting out, that it could well, and it's a very difficult task, but leaders may well be called upon to contain the collective emotions of society, which is in and of itself very challenging, but those are amplified at the moment and very real. And there's a possibility, if leaders do not get the next phase of this right, that there will be, at the very worst, civil unrest or revolution. But certainly what we may see is that a sort of role reversal in this trust that we talked about at the beginning of this call, namely that trust in government will diminish very rapidly. And people may well reinvest their trust in business, because business is what's going to hopefully get many people out of this hole, but only if it's led well, and only if it can put food back on the table, and people will want to see that proven. So, so maybe this is another opportunity for people to sit and take 60 seconds to think about what the societal impact of what's happened will be. And of course, many of you in different societies, the Netherlands, Poland, wherever you are in the world, it will be quite different. The approach to managing this crisis has been quite different in different jurisdictions. What does it mean for society in general, specifically with respect to leadership? And we'll give you 60 seconds to journal that. And then we're going to give you a few moments to sit and talk about it one more time. Okay, so having given a moment to think about that, now I'm going to set you a task, which is a very challenging one. So Martin Scorsese, when he's struggling with a film, with a script, he will challenge his writers to sum up what the movie is about in one sentence. And then once they've kind of coalesced around that one sentence and agreed what the sentence is, what the movie is about, he will then challenge them to come up what the movie is about in one word, which is extremely challenging. What is the central thing? Now, I'm not going to ask you to do that second bit, but what I'm going to ask you to do is to sum up your conversation, the conversation you're about to have, in one sentence. And we're going to give you 10 minutes to talk about what is the structural shift in society. You can answer the question. We'll put the slide back on the screen, and then to sum that up in one sentence for us. Welcome back, everybody. And just as we close the session, we set you a very stiff task, which was to distill down into one sentence the question that we posed for you to talk about, namely, what's the role of leadership in society and how will it affect us? And we'd love to hear from each group in turn. Can write it on the chat board if you want, or otherwise someone can speak up. Let's hear from you one at a time. Group one.
Well, group one is Uche, Femke, Frank, and Sigrid.
Okay, call on Uche. My friend Uche, come on. What did you say?
Uche, you're on mute. Hold on, I'm gonna unmute you.
Yeah, please.
Okay. What we decided was really a question. How to lead an orchestra. In the sense that you have an orchestra who is actually, I'll make that one statement: how to lead an orchestra.
Exactly, perfect. I think that's a really beautiful image. Thank you, Uche. Okay, who's in group two?
Beatrice, Elko, Paul, Pearl, and Sunray.
If you're shy, you can write it on the chat.
Well, no, I'm happy to say it, and I think we went through a sort of an iteration of different thoughts, and we started with fair process, and then we went to transparency, trust, and eventually we came to what Beatrice suggested as courage, to be the leader of the future. And I think courage sort of it takes a lot of initiative and a new leadership that is willing to take the risk. And am I going to constantly look at excellence, or am I going to take the courage to be something different and try? Because in uncertainty, you never know the answer. So you've got to push yourselves to get to something. So I think courage is what we finally came up with.
Fantastic. You got it down to one word. So you did Scorsese's exercise perfectly. Thanks, Iram. Well done. Very nice. Okay, group three.
Cynthia, Darlene, Oriane, and Remco, and Ronan.
Yeah, Oriane wrote something, actually. Oriane wrote, more widespread engagement leading to more accountability. So this is...
No, that's not where we ended up. I've just been writing too much. You should ask somebody else to summarize.
Anyone want to volunteer? From
maybe I can go. I think we talked about the power of community, the leader enabling the community to emerge. And instead of the leader taking leadership in driving what the community should do, is allowing the community to actually self-manage and come up with how they can contribute. And
that's beautiful. So emergent leadership enabled by a community. That's a very interesting thought. Thanks, Cynthia. Beautiful. Okay, group four.
Carolyn, Flores, Lorenz, and Michel.
Okay, we'll come back to them. Group five.
That's it. We have 4 groups.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Well, so nobody from group 4, so I go ahead and just quickly for us, we started out on the question of something more like a moral compass, leaders being a moral compass, because in so many ways the world is insecure. And it is about balance. More also as a container deciding the undecidable, speaking the unspeakable. It was then about charisma and the question of a humble charismatic leader, because obviously there's something around followership also in these times of insecurity. And the question, what leaders are the followers going to create?
Very nice. Thank you, Lorenz. That's beautifully captured. Okay, thanks everybody. I'm going to turn over to Claire, who will close the session for us. Claire.
Thank you. And Lorenz, you sort of really sparked something, which is, I think, ultimately, this is all about culture. And we're talking about shifts in systems, but ultimately this will play out in the culture of organizations, in the culture of society, and also in the culture of our communities as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, we at KDVI are so interested in running these learning labs, because we want to try and understand and be able to help our clients understand where culture is going to be going as they come out of the crisis, rather than waiting and sort of being reactive. So we really appreciate the time that you give and you contribute to these learning labs, because it helps us really begin to refine and understand how we can begin to help clients in this area. And I think, given the time, I'm just going to say thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the learning lab. It's always an experiment. I hope you enjoyed Graham and Mai's attempt at unfabricated dialogue. It was completely authentic. Make of that what you will. And enjoy your long weekends. I think most people have got bank holidays this weekend, and look forward to seeing you, some of you, at our next learning labs or around and about. Take care.